Hey everyone, welcome to a new video series that I've started. This will be the first video in my retro computing line of videos that I want to do. The first ones will be on building your own retro PC from scratch. So I'm just going to go through the steps of what to buy, what not to buy, what I do, and all that sort of stuff. So basically, today will be the first video, and I'm doing that on motherboards. Now, for a retro computer, the motherboard is the most important part, and should really be the first thing that you buy or decide to buy, because whatever's on the motherboard will dictate what you can actually do in your retro computer. It'll be what memory you can run, what CPU you can run, what interface cards you can run, what sound cards you can run, what case you can put it in. It's all dependent on the actual motherboard. So it's the first part, and definitely there is a few things to decide. Now, if you grew up with retro computers in the day when they were actually not retro, when they were actually the best thing you could get as a kid, then you may have a CPU that, like if you had like a 386 machine and you really wanted to do that again, well then you could build a machine with a 386 processor and a 386 motherboard. And the sentimental value of that is huge. But that's something to decide is what do you want to do. If you just want to have a computer where you can run DOS 622 and Windows 98 SE, that's how I do my builds. I dual boot 622 and 98 SE, and that covers pretty much most games from sort of around the mid 80s to probably 2005, somewhere around there. So obviously, 98 SE is for Windows games, and then DOS is obviously for DOS stuff as well. I find it works really well because there are some games that were Windows only, and Windows works out for that. So that's another choice to decide, but that can come later. The motherboard is the most important part. So if you've got a sentimental value, choose what you grew up with, and that's totally fine. I'm going to run through some options here. As you can see, I've got a few different motherboards here and tell you how I do it and the reasons for that, etc, etc. Now, there are different sizes of motherboards. Back in the day when computers started out, they were called XTs, and they had huge motherboards, absolutely huge. Now, I don't have any XT motherboards to show you. I have a larger AT board here, which was where they went to. They went from XT to AT, and then in AT you get baby AT as well, and then obviously you get ATX, which is the latest one, which most people know, which has your backplate, your little IO shield backplate, whatever you want to call it, and that goes into the case, and then the motherboard goes into that. So that's really important, guys. The casing, the type of motherboard will dictate what case you can use. Most people will just go ATX because you can buy ATX cases. But if you're like me, I actually got some original, I call them the flip-top lid AT cases, where you push the two buttons in and the lid pops up. Because they're the cases I had when I was a kid, so it has a lot of sentimental value. So for me, I had to have an AT case. Actually a baby AT to be more precise, for that very reason. Now, with baby AT, you can still get some pretty good motherboards. The last motherboard in baby AT is a slot 1 socket 370. So this guy here, this is not actually an AT, this is actually an ATX, as you can see. But I'm running out of room on my tech bench to put motherboards, so I just chose this one to show. But as you can see, slot 1 in here, and you can have socket 370. Now, this is the last Pentium 3s, the last motherboards you can actually get in AT, or baby AT. So that's important. So if you want to do that, this is the way to go. This is what I do. They're not hard to find. Obviously, you can find them in ATX if you want to just use an ATX case, which a lot of people will, so that's totally fine as well. The other big thing is you've got RAM. SD RAM is very easy to get. You've got PC66, which is 66 megahertz. Then you've got 100 megahertz, and then you've got 133 megahertz. So you've got that as well. Normally I get them the chipset. I normally get an Intel one. This is a VIA. The 440BX is probably the best chipset to get on a slot 1 or a socket 370. You can still get ISA ports, which are these guys here, which you need. You need to have at least one ISA port for your sound card. Now, yes, you can get PCI sound cards, and yes, some of them do work in DOS, but if you really want a graphics card, a sound card that's going to work in DOS, you need to have an ISA slot, which is this guy here. Now, this motherboard only has one. Normally, most BXs will actually have two, and that's what I recommend you have, is a minimum of two. One for the sound card, then one for something else. Normally, what I do is I run an ISA sound card and an ISA network card, and that network card I use for DOS networking. For running multiplayer games like, Warcraft 2, Command and Conquer, all those games that were multiplayer, I use an ISA network card that's NE 2000 compatible, and that's why I have two. Some boards do have three, but you're going to start to pay a bit more for that. But it's totally up to you. You've obviously that's your ISA, these are PCI, this is AGP. Now, if you notice, this is a VIA motherboard, so there's actually no little notch in here. So this is an open AGP port. It will support both 3.3 volt and 5 volt cards, I'm pretty sure. So that's handy as well. Obviously, you've got IDE on board, which means you don't have to run another card for your IDE and your floppy ports, etc. Obviously, that's the floppy connector there. Very important. I do like to have a machine with a real floppy drive. You can still buy real floppy drives, brand new Sony ones, on eBay. So that's very handy as well. And then if you have a look over here, you've got this as a slot 1. This is where your cartridge goes for your CPU, for your Pentium 3. Or you could run a Pentium 2. You can run anything Pentium 2, Pentium 3. Even a Celeron is going to be fast enough for DOS and 98 SE. Then you've got your power connector. Now, the power connector is important because that'll tell you what power supply you have. Whether you have an ATX, this is an ATX power supply. This one doesn't have, because it's ATX, it doesn't have the AT power connector, but a board I'll just show you in a second will have that. So that's basically it, guys. That's the motherboards I choose. They have a lot of ports on them, like this one's got 2 serial, your parallel, USB, and your PS2 mouse and keyboard. So it's got all of the expansion that you possibly need. The advantage of PCI is that you can still buy PCI cards these days, so you can pretty much plug anything in and it'll work. So that's a slot 1 or socket 370, Pentium 2, Pentium 3, Celeron, socket 370 are in these boards here, guys. So that's that guy. Now, the next board, this is an AT, or a baby AT, and as you can see, there's no connectors here. There's just one for the keyboard. Sometimes you get one here for the mouse, for a PS2 mouse, or it's not there and you can actually solder it in, so that's common. But this is for an AT, and as you can see, the actual shape is a hell of a lot different in size physically, because it's different. The mounting holes are different, everything's different. You've got to get either a baby AT or an ATX so that you know what case that you're running. That's very, very important. Now, this is a Intel TX 430TX motherboard. It's the last chipset Intel did for the socket 7s. This is a socket 7, but this is actually technically a super socket 7. So this will do your AMD K62s, K63s, your Cyrix chips. I don't know if this does the VIA Edens. Maybe not. Maybe you need an actual VIA chipset. I haven't done a lot of playing with them on socket 7, but that's basically your options. And then obviously the Pentium series. So your Pentium 2, your Pentium 233 MMX will go in here. And it's rated at 230 megahertz, obviously. So that would be the CPU I would use for one of these. In socket 7. You can see you can still run SD RAM. You've got 72 pin slots here. You cannot run them both at the same time. You either have 72s only or SD RAM only. I recommend just going with SD RAM. You don't need a lot. Some games won't run if you have more than 16 meg of RAM. So a 16 meg PC 100 or PC 133, SD RAM is totally fine, and it'll be enough for all the games that you want. Now, getting back to the power connectors, as you can see here, you've got your ATX here. Your ATX is here, and this is an ATX power plug. So this is really handy because you can run either power supply. Now, obviously, an ATX power supply is more common and easier to get. So with these, I normally run the ATX. One thing to note, however, is ISA slots have -5 volts on them, available to ISA cards that you plug in. A lot of ATX power supplies do not supply -5 volts. Okay, some sound cards will require that, some interface cards do, and if it's not there, it doesn't work. Now, there is a new little PCB that you can plug in here called I think it's the Voltage Blaster, and what it does is it's a little -5 volt power regulator. So if you don't have -5 volts coming from your ATX supply, this little board will actually supply it to your ISA slots. So that's a handy little piece of kit. What I do is when you're buying an ATX power supply, especially for a retro machine, anything with ISA, you really should get something that's got -5. Now, on the big sticker on a power supply, it will actually tell you if there's -5, and it'll tell you how many amps it puts out. So that's something to note. Now, on the AT, if you're going to use an AT power supply, it already has -5, so you don't have to worry about -5 at all. It's just if you're running an ATX power supply. Now, you've got onboard I/O, so you've got your IDE, 2 IDE ports, your floppy port, floppy ports here. Your floppy ports here, and your 2 IDE there, and that's the printer port. I think these are the 2 serial ports. Because it's not ATX, you have little headers that come off, and then you plug everything in. So that's the advantage of ATX, is you don't have all these cables going everywhere. But with an AT, they don't have that, obviously. So that's pretty much it, guys, on that one. The biggest thing with these is the limit on your CPU, but a Pentium 233 MMX is heaps fast for any DOS games, or Windows 98 SE is totally fine for that. So that's a Socket 7 430 Intel TX chipset. That's one of these boards. Now, I wanted to talk about quickly, if I can, this is an older board that I've got. I think it's a 386. I think it's a 386. Now, this is quite a big board. It's not a baby AT. It's a little bit bigger. But I just wanted to show you this. It's heaps old. As you can see, you actually have here, this is actually chip RAM. You actually socket, all these sockets here, you actually plug RAM chips in to give you memory, which is a little bit different. Most people probably haven't seen that. Is this a 386? Yeah, okay, this is a 386. I thought it was. And so here you've only got ISA. So you've got an 8-bit ISA here, and then you've got a 16-bit ISA here. So that's very important. As you can see, it's still got the keyboard port here, so it's still an AT or an XT. So that's all good too. So guys, that's the first video that I wanted to do. If you have any more questions, please let me know in the comments below, or send me an email, or catch up with me on Discord or on my webpage. Thanks for watching, guys.